Hello, everybody. Welcome to the inaugural episode of our great experiment. Thank you so much for clicking on this video and watching. It means the world to me to have your support. So today we have a tremendous guest. A.J. Schumann is a social critic concerned with the future of democracy and the role of working people in shaping society. He studied history and political science at the University of New Mexico, where he was recognized as a Truman Scholar. More recently, he worked at the Institute for Policy Studies as a Henry A. Wallace Fellow. When he isn't organizing or writing, you can likely find him reading comic books and listening to punk rock. Today's conversation is excellent. I hope you enjoy. Here is A.J. Schumann. AJ, how are you doing?
I'm okay, all things considered. Thanks for having me on. How are you?
I am well. I can't tell you enough how much I appreciate you being the canary in the coal mine on this project, coming on, being the first guest for our great experiment. It's really a privilege to have you on.
Well, thank you. It's a privilege to be here.
So before we get into, kind of some questions about you and what you're thinking about currently and your perspectives on American politics and kind of the future we're headed towards. I would be remiss if I didn't start by talking about the catalyst for this project. Um, I, like most people, watched the events of this past Wednesday with shock and horror for a lot of reasons. The study of political violence is pretty mixed on whether or not it's truly rising. Some scholars think that, yeah, political violence is on the rise, whereas others say it's actually not, but it's just because these high-profile cases are making us feel like political violence is becoming more mainstream and more common. Regardless, just off the top of my head, in the past 10 years, I can think of Steve Scalise in 2017 getting shot at the congressional baseball game. I think of January 6th. I think of President Trump, uh, the assassination attempt on his life last July. I think of this past June when a Democratic state lawmaker in Minnesota was assassinated. And then, of course, um, the tragic events that happened on Utah Valley University with Charlie Kirk. So I want to open this by kind of having a discussion about political violence and I guess what your perception is of these trends in our society right now.
Yeah, you're really throwing the easy ones at me first. But no, it's certainly worth reflecting on at this point in our political climate. The events of last Wednesday, Charlie Kirk's assassination, I think were a sort of collective point of trauma for really everyone in the country, kind of regardless of your political opinion. I'm, almost diametrically opposed to every political viewpoint that Charlie Kirk held. But to see him be, killed in such a graphic manner is obviously horrific. Particularly as someone who's also outspoken, about my politics. Yeah, it's a frightening atmosphere when speaking your mind about political issues can be cause for mortal concern. Um, I would say, however, that political violence. I mean, you know more about this from sort of the poli sci perspective. I'm more of a kind of a student of history, and so the way that I interpret political violence is I would have these two main comments. The first is that when you look at the longue durée of American history, political violence is actually not that uncommon. And acts, like we saw this past Wednesday, although traumatic and shocking, of course, are really not an aberration in the tradition of American politics. One in five U.S. presidents have been the subject of an assassination attempt. One in 10 have been assassinated. Um, you can go through like the course of U.S. history and find many notable events of politics boiling over to the point of violence. Obviously on the streets in the forms of riots, but also in halls of power. Like the caning of Charles Sumner, for example. Um, so it's really not an aberration. What is unique about this incident is that it was targeted at someone who was not someone who did not hold a position of formal power, but was rather a commentator. And to that end, that's sort of why I voiced such kind of why I think it's so frightening, because it suggests that even articulating political opinions is somehow grounds for physical retaliation. My second, and that's obviously bad, and we should do what we can to, to prevent that in the future. And we can sort of talk about, ways I envision that to happen. But my second comment is that when we talk about political violence, it is so often confined to those sort of flashpoint moments that I talked about, which are these very graphic, shocking moments, where I think that regardless of your political opinion, you can sort of see the humanity that is lost in these moments. Uh, my argument would be that we should extend that feeling of humanity to people who are subjects of political violence in much less much less flashy and much less covered ways in terms of media coverage. So political violence, for example, in the form of widespread police brutality, political violence in terms of foreign policy, and people dying abroad by the thousands, particularly now in Gaza. I think that part of the reason that Charlie Kirk's assassination was so kind of traumatic is because a lot of the people were exposed to the kind of imagery that that some of us have been inundated by for years at this point, seeing the imagery coming out of Gaza. So my only point is that there are more systemic forms of political violence that also bear a large human cost. And I hope that this is a moment where we can see the humanity lost in one instance and bridge that to the humanity lost in these much larger instances.
Yeah, I mean, as as shocking and horrific, for people to, in our digital age, to be able to go onto your phone and, see these things, whether we're talking about um, the political violence of this past Wednesday or, the events that have been occurring for years in Gaza and the Middle East. What's maybe just as frightening, at least in the American context, is the reaction to
Mm,
the political violence, because it seems to me, as just an observer, that this is a bipartisan issue. It's not, a left-wing problem or a right-wing problem. And the response to Charlie Kirk's assassination has been much the same. Finger pointing, using uh, this the suspect in custody as a political football to try to, pin the suspect as a liberal or as a conservative, to try to use it to gain political advantage. And I don't know what it says about our culture when we're so tribal that instead of resolving our conflict with words, we deem it justifiable to solve our disagreements with bullets, with violence. And it doesn't seem to me that everyone's upset about this, right? And it doesn't seem to me that if the shoe were on the other foot, that the reaction wouldn't be the same from the right.
mm.
If and God forbid that these continue to occur, right? It will. I've seen a lot of criticism from, the right talking about different members on the left, making a joke about this, right? I'm not convinced, though, as someone who observes American politics, that if a figure on the left was assassinated, right, that the response from the right would be any different.
Yeah, I would tend to agree, and I think that that is emblematic of of a deeper division in our social structures, of kind of the seams of society kind of starting to fray, and we can kind of see the violent underbelly that lies beneath. Um, I think that uh, I think that any I think that the to the extent that I do understand any kind of catharsis that is derived from people on the left by Charlie Kirk's demise, it would be people who were victimized by the kind of rhetoric that he employed. But even that, I don't think is necessarily, I don't think necessarily rises to the level of, wanting to see him perish, from the earth. And so I think that yeah, to make light of to make light of that event is particularly kind of an anti-social phenomenon. But as you say, I think that if the shoe were on the other foot, the same would be true of those, on the right. And so the question becomes, how do we encourage pro-social behavior with our political opponents? And I think it begins sort of with conversations like this. It begins by recognizing that the people with whom you have political disagreements are also human, and also, are flesh and blood and have, families and have reasons for their beliefs that they've come to over years of their life, and things that have happened to them that have honed, their political development. And I think that trying to come to that kind of understanding might stem the tide of that antisocial behavior. In a way, to me, the kind of the worst tragedy of this is that Charlie Kirk has become more of an idea than a person. Because rather than, being a person who has obviously agency and is able to, go and engage in whatever kind of political discourse, he saw fit, his death, and his life subsequently has become a political football, right? And likewise, so has the shooters in a sense. The shooter is less of a person and more of an idea that is sort of used to wage war between, the partisan sides. It's a matter of substantial debate right now whether he was on the left or on the right or on the far left or on the far right. And to me, what's less his motivation for committing the act is less important than the social conditions that allowed that act to happen in the first place. And by that, I mean the dehumanization of political opponents, which is really what we have to address at the root in order to, prevent things like this happening in the future.
Brilliantly put. I think one last note on this is that I think what's particularly frightening about this instance compared to, all acts of political violence should be condemned entirely. But this one in particular, I think, struck a lot of people, even those who weren't fans of Charlie Kirk, because Charlie Kirk isn't an elected official. Charlie
Hmm.
Kirk made a living by going to college campuses and having obviously vigorous disagreements with people, but for the most part, there was mutual respect a lot of the times, right? People would come up to a microphone and have spirited discourse with the individual. But that's within his right, right? That's within his First Amendment right as a thinker, as an American, right? That's the way politics should be practiced, right? By giving people of opposing viewpoints the opportunity to have that dialogue. And so when someone who is not, making legislation, but simply having discourse, and they are um, the victim of an assault like this, it's harrowing for those of us who think about politics, but especially those people who spend their entire lives making a living by having discourse, whether, they're influencers, they're pundits, whatever, journalists, right? Now all of a sudden, the realm of political violence has opened into into their home, and that's unnerving.
Yeah, certainly so. If I was to have sort of a response to that, I think that I agree. I mean, it's unnerving for someone who doesn't hold formal power to face. I mean, it's unnerving for anyone to suffer this fate, but particularly for someone who doesn't have formal power, for someone who's a commentator. Because as I mentioned at the beginning, that sort of stirs terror in people like you and I, who are, who have a commitment to, facilitating political discourse. Um, I would say though that there is an important distinction to be made between genuine and disingenuous discourse, because there is a superstructure of so-called discourse in this country that is really anything but. And I say this as someone who was, a debate kid in high school, but the style of debating that is situated such that like I hold this position, you hold that position. Let's sort of duke it out until one of us is humiliated, and the other one feels that they've won, so to speak. The kind of prove me wrong style of debating was absolutely kind of shepherded by people like Charlie Kirk, by people like Ben Shapiro. And that isn't to say that people like that on the left don't exist, because there are certainly people like that who do. One coming to mind is like the streamer Destiny, for example. Or on TikTok, there's this sort of new crop of younger debaters, like Dean Withers and the like. And the commonality between them is that the function of it is more of a spectacle than it is a personal engagement. And so I'm of course not trying to blame the victim for what happened in this instance, but I am trying to articulate that there's an antisocial nature to what we've come to expect of discourse as this sort of as this kind of this like debate bro style communicating, which is not rooted in the things that I mentioned, earlier. It's not rooted in understanding the person sitting across from you as a human being, but rather as, as a debate opponent. In speech and debate, in high school, I don't know if they still do this, but you used to train by speaking to the wall. You would stand in front of the wall and rehearse, your arguments. And we should not be treating other people like that wall. You know what I mean? We should be treating other people as though they're coming to this with the exact same degree of depth of life experience and the degree of rationale for their beliefs. Um, and I think that if there's any like good to come out of this, it is hopefully a revised understanding of what discourse should mean. Because I hope that conversations like this are what characterize political discourse going forward, as opposed to that sort of structure of debate that I mentioned previously.
Yeah. I thought it was really important to set the tone of today's conversation by starting with this, given that it's, you know, the big story in the news right now. But I want to move on, and I want to get to know you, AJ. So could you tell me a little bit about what motivates you? Like, what issues are you passionate about to engage in politics for?
Yeah, certainly. So I'm from New Mexico. I'm from a town called Rio Rancho, which is just outside of Albuquerque. Um, I grew up in a working class family. Our lives generally characterized by economic precarity. But my granddad was a retired labor organizer. He was an organizer for the International Brotherhood of Boilermakers and Pipe Fitters. And he was organizing in the late 60s, 70s, and mostly in the 70s, at a point when the power of organized labor was diminishing. And so I grew up hearing a lot of kind of war stories about kind of the fall of organized labor. And so I think combining the experiences of sort of hearing my grandpa's stories and being influenced by that while also concurrently living through the working class experience that 70% of this country is subject to. 70% of this country lives paycheck to paycheck. Those two things combined have made me particularly interested, obviously, in labor, but in the role that working people play in society more broadly. My politics are ultimately about the average person, the everyday American, should have control over their lives. They should have decision-making power in their lives. And so I often describe myself as, as an avid supporter of, small d democracy. In that, democracy should not be something that ends at the ballot box, a ritual that you perform every 4 years, but something that is a continual practice that permeates every structure you interact with. And so, obviously, that means in the workplace, unionization in the workplace. But also, tenant unions that give tenants some degree of decision-making power over their living circumstances, participatory budgeting, in local towns, giving residents of towns some decision-making power over how funds are spent in their community. In schools, parents, teachers, students should have some decision-making power over the curricula and the operation of their school. So yeah, those are the kind of the basics of my politics. And it's fundamentally I'm a supporter of the common person, the everyday American.
70% of Americans living paycheck to paycheck. Most Americans living paycheck to paycheck, struggling to make ends meet, working multiple jobs. Maybe they're raising families, maintaining relationships. How is it possible for, working class Americans to engage in politics? Right? We see voter turnout, who votes? Well, it's the educated, it's or I should say credentialed, right? It's people with education credentials, it's older Americans, it's wealthier Americans. How do those who have less time, less resources, engage in small d democracy?
That's a great question, and it's something that I'm trying to devote my all of my energies towards. Is figuring out that the answer to that question. I think that it's a mixture of structural reforms that are needed, because there are certain elements that are at present out of most people's control. The fact that the federal minimum wage has not been raised, in over a decade, um, is problematic. The fact that many Americans who are employed are underemployed. They're in positions where they're being paid sub minimum wage, or in positions where they have no reasonable benefits or protections, like workers in the gig economy. There are structural things here that need to be addressed. We need revisions in labor law, and we need protections for workplace organizing. Um, Effectively, what I'm trying to say is we need reforms to raise the floor for people. I used to be a political organizer, on the electoral side of things. And a common refrain would be, we need to get, young people engaged in politics. We need to get young people, out of, well, whatever, out of playing video games and into the streets, knocking doors, so on and so forth. But most young people today are subject to a vicious labor market, where it's extremely difficult to find work, and when you do find work, it is often not not sufficient to keep up with the rising cost of living, inflation. And so we need structural reforms that will stimulate the lower class of society and raise the floor, because you can't be expected to participate in the political process if you're in an unstable situation. So that's one side of it. And to that end, I think that we should throw our energies behind supporting candidates who support those kinds of structural reforms, and policies that would, enact them. So, for example, in New York City, Zoran Mamdani, I think, is a great example of a candidate whose platform is fundamentally concerned with affordability, which obviously in a city like New York is a primary concern. People of any political, religious, ethnic, any stripe of all sort of different backgrounds are subject to the economic forces that structure everyday life. And so, his platform, Mamdani's platform, is based around raising the floor for those people. If they pay less for transit, if they pay less for groceries, that will make a difference in their everyday life. And when, in the absence of that economic pressure, they will be able to participate politically because they'll have the time and the energy. That's the one side of it. The other side of it, I think, is community organizing. We don't necessarily have to rely, although we should push for structural reforms from those in formal power, we don't necessarily have to rely on them to satisfy all of our needs. And in fact, the formal political process moves so slowly in this country that often we have to resort to community organizing in order to meet some of those needs. Um, so this can manifest in a lot of different ways. This can be mutual aid groups. These can be faith-based groups. But the idea is getting people in your community together and pooling your resources and providing social services between each other as community members. And that is also a form of, raising the floor. I was at a conference not too long ago where I met someone who is part of this group called Hoosier Action in Indiana, which is a community group that effectively, they meet, a couple of times a month, and they pool their resources so that everyone in the community can get by. And that can mean, exchanging like books, for school children. That can mean food drives for people who, are struggling to get groceries that month. Um, it can mean a lot of different things. But the point is that the floor needs to be raised, and we should invest in candidates and policies who are trying to do that at a structural level, and also begin to engage in community efforts that are trying to do that at a grassroots level.
Yeah, so many. To touch upon your point too, specifically about young people, right? Young people engaging in the political process. There's the common refrain, if you go back, it seems like every decade, the youngest generation is always getting, tortured. And this goes on for, generations. It's always common practice to, hurl insults at the youth, right? For being lazy, for not, working. Um, and obviously, this is untrue. As so many young people are told, they're in high school, they're told, oh, well, go to trade school, go to college, go do something good with your life. And they do. They make the right choices. Yet so many young people find themselves, they go to college, they get a 4-year degree, and they're left jobless at the end of that 4-year degree. Not only are they jobless, but they're also tens of thousands of dollars in debt.
Right.
And so I think, you know, clearly there are structural barriers preventing even those who, quote unquote, are making the right choices uh, from being able to live comfortably where they can have time to engage in the process. But I want to ask, this is a big question, right? But taking into consideration, your concerns, uh, how do you look towards the future of American politics when we think about working people getting engaged? Are you optimistic?
That's a good question. I choose to be optimistic, and I'll tell you why. The late Michael Brooks has this great saying, "Be cruel to systems, be kind to people." Uh, and I really do, I believe that. And I think that most people, again, regardless of whatever their personal background might be, and even regardless of what their political persuasion is, have the same basic set of needs that have to be addressed. On a very basic level, that's, they have to feed themselves and their family. They need shelter, they need, but, on a larger level, they need community engagement, socialization. They need material means necessary to live a fulfilling life. And so, to that end, when enough of the population's needs are simply not being met, system breakdown tends to occur. And again, being a student of history, that is what tends to precede every social transformation, is a massive stratification of wealth, and often it's combined with a this sort of noxious combination of private economic power with public regulatory power, um, and which often results in most people not having their material needs met because the wealth that society does produce ends up accumulating at the top of society rather than, being distributed evenly or more evenly. Um, and so I choose to be optimistic because I think that what I'm trying to say is I believe in people and they will persevere because their needs have to be met. And I think that eventually we will reach the point where we understand that our political disagreements, even if they are serious, our disagreements about various social, cultural issues, matters of policy, we will begin to recognize as citizens, as people on the ground floor of America, so to speak, that we are functionally in the same position. We're in the same boat. Our interests are aligned. Um, and conversely, I don't have faith in many of the systems that are structuring our lives. But I say that in an optimistic sense, not in sort of a hopeless sense, because I see that as a sign that the uh, the barriers to political engagement and to self-fulfillment that currently characterize daily life have a horizon. And beyond that horizon is a better world that is just waiting to be made real. And I think we need enough people on the ground floor of America and of the world to realize that we're part of the same sort of the same class unit, that we have the same material interests. And I do believe that that is coming, that is coming to the fore. That sort of consciousness is coming to the fore. I think that you can see that certainly from kind of the ramifications of the 2008 financial recession and the Occupy Wall Street movement. Um, even more recently with the Luigi Mangione um, uh, you know incident and the killing of Brian Thompson. That not to loop this back around to political violence, but that was a scenario in which people on the left and the right realized that they are both subject to a cruel structure, a cruel system that is depriving them of financial security, in that case, the healthcare system. And so when you have people, across the aisle, so to speak, making those realizations, then you can get substantial social transformation, which is what I expect in the next, as in the next, 20, 30 years. Social transformation is a process. But from what I can tell from all outward appearances, it appears as though we're on that track. So that's a short way of saying I choose to be optimistic because I think the systems will change because they have to change.
Yeah, thinking along those same lines, right? Americans have no faith in institutions, and this has been something that it's not new. It's been a decades-long observation, especially with faith in Congress, trust in Congress, often hovers around 10%, right? Public opinion of the president is very rarely above 50%, kind of echoing those divides between left and right. But a more recent trend has been the dip in trust in the Supreme Court, of course.
Mm.
The Supreme Court was at once, heralded as the one institution you could look to that Americans did trust. Um, they had faith that the Supreme Court would do the right thing, whatever the right thing is. But the conversation about democracy has populated our politics for the last 5 years now, really. Longer than that, but it's been at the forefront of the conversation for the past half decade. Uh, where do you see democracy currently?
Well, I see at the moment, I think that we're beginning to realize and this is something that a lot of members of our society have realized since the very beginning that our society is not very democratic. Our structures are not very democratic, and I think that more people are beginning to realize that. Uh, the lack of confidence in public institutions is a reflection that more people are coming around to that idea. And there's the argument to be made that this country wasn't intended to be a democracy; it's intended to be a republic. I've often heard that, and that is true. But there's a flaw in that logic, which is that when this polity was created, the country was very different than what it is now. 200 almost 250 years later. Uh, and the problem is a problem of scale. We do live in a representative republic. That's how our government is structured. We have the oldest continuous constitution in the world, actually. Even though, other countries by various metrics are older, our system of government is the oldest continuously practiced system of government in the world. Um, and I think that there is a deficiency in that when you have a 21st century population of 300 million people grappling with 21st century issues, trying to mediate those issues under a constitution, under a body of laws and structures that were established in the 18th century. Uh, so what I'm trying to say is that from the outset of this country coming to being, there were flaws with the structures of our government. And actually, I go back to this. This was something that philosophers then, intellectuals then were aware of. Rousseau wrote about the deficiency of representative government, and it's that as a system grows, each constituent has less of a connection to their representative. A member of the U.S. House of Representatives today represents 750,000 constituents, which is an absurd amount of people. There is an absurd variety of political opinion, of life experience, of all manner of things that system can scarcely be called representative. Uh, and so I think that we're at a spot where, again, as I mentioned earlier, substantial social transformation will have to be made. And that means, at least in part, revising many of the structures that we have come to know, that we have come to take as somehow, divinely inspired. I think that we need to remember that these structures were created by human beings in response to the conditions of their time, and there should be no shame in admitting that material circumstances have changed as time has progressed, and our structures need to be updated to revise that. You mentioned the Supreme Court, and I think that that's a good example because, as you know, there's no constitutional limit on the number of Supreme Court justices. It is a statutory limit, which could theoretically be increased or decreased at any point in time. And I, for one, am in favor of increasing the number of Supreme Court justices. And I know that the counter argument to that is so-called packing the court. Um, but I am equally in favor of instituting term limits on Supreme Court justices. I think that the idea of anyone in position of power having a right to that office until death is a medieval concept. And you can kind of see, you can see again, like this is an 18th century form of government. You can see they were working with influences that they had. Um, uh, and so I think that we need structural revisions to bodies like the Supreme Court if public confidence is to be restored. Same thing goes for Congress. I'm a proponent of term limits for members of Congress because there is absolutely at this point a documented trend of people holding on to power for far longer than they are even mentally capable. And even if the mental deficiency wasn't a an issue as politicians age, the power of incumbency becomes nigh insurmountable as you develop a certain degree of political momentum. It becomes very difficult for new voices to supplant incumbents. That's another reason why I think that there's a lack of trust or a lack of confidence in Congress. Because most people feel that there's no means for them as a community or as an individual to interface with that body because that body is populated by people who have been there for decades and who are relatively set in their ways and are going to vote, a certain way regardless of whatever you have to say. And I think that generating new, like getting, fresh blood, so to speak, in those systems um, is if not the solution, is part of the solution.
Yeah, and talking about these concepts of change, right? How could we look to change these institutions, right? The Constitution is deified at this point, right? For most Americans, and again, it's not my job to comment on whether or not that's an accurate deification, right? But the Constitution is heralded as a great document by a majority of Americans. And when you look to ideas of change, right, you can adopt the concept of, the great experiment, right? Laboratories of democracy. You can look to state governments, right? How are state institutions structured compared to our federal institutions? For example, the state I currently reside in, Missouri, the Missouri Supreme Court, not only do they have term limits, but also they have to retire when they're 70.
Mm.
There's a cap at 70, which that's a really interesting debate that I think as young people continue to feel further and further disconnected from politics, right? Kind of connecting this back to young people's involvement in politics. With the presidential election of 2024, before President Biden stepped down, right? We were going to have two candidates, one over 80 and one on the precipice of turning 80. And I think perhaps, this debate over, age being a disqualifier, I think is only going to continue to permeate our politics. But just thinking rationally, given how difficult it is to amend the Constitution, right? Are you, when you think honestly, are you hopeful that there's any possibility of real institutional change?
I mean, well, okay, so again, I choose to be optimistic, but if I'm being so for real, uh, the American system of government is not set up in a way that it is easy to change. Um, Change was built in as a mechanism. Obviously, there are 27 amendments to the Constitution, but it's a very difficult process to get to that point, and it was made so intentionally. And it was made inefficient intentionally. Alexis de Tocqueville talked about how the inefficiency of American government would be its saving grace. And he said that in reference to his country. France had just gone through a bloody revolution. There is certainly danger to rapid transformation. Absolutely. Looping it back around to political violence. Typically, rapid transformation comes with all sorts of, messy things. But conversely, rigid institutional rigidity is not desirable either. And so I think that like we should do what we can to support structural changes to our system of government. But as you mentioned, the laboratories of democracy are at the smaller scale. Because as I was saying earlier, as a polity increases in scale, it becomes difficult for constituents within that polity to even understand each other, to know each other, let alone to feel represented authentically by their elected official. And so I think that at the state and local level, there is real opportunity for laboratories of democracy to do really interesting things. And you brought up, your state as an example of that. And I think that on an even smaller level, communities, and neighborhoods can operate as laboratories of democracy in a way that our federal system never could, because they have they know each other, they're in proximity to each other, And it's a small enough scale that any change can happen on a quicker basis. They can change something and then realize it doesn't work, change it back, or change it to a different thing. And so if I do have any hope in like the mechanism of social transformation, it's going to happen on a state and local level. That said, we shouldn't abandon the idea of larger change to our governmental structures, and we should fight for that. Uh, but I often think that it's the bottom-up strategy of, testing things out at a local and state level that then bolsters the ability to change things at the federal level because you can point to it working. You can point to the positive benefits of those changes. And ideally, under the federalist system, you would be able to elect people from your local constituency who then go, represent those ideas at the federal level. Um, but yeah, I understand what you're saying. I mean, it's difficult to change the American system of government, but that shouldn't stop us from trying.
You mentioned something really interesting, right? About, the United States is a vast country, right? It's so large that it's hard to really know one another, right? Like what truly is a commonality between someone living in California versus someone living in South Dakota, right? Are those two individuals even of the same country, right? And if you were to look on social media, right? If you only knew America via the way it's presented on social media or cable television, news, you wouldn't have a very optimistic outlook about, your neighbor, right? Because we are portrayed as uh, in mainstream news and on social media of being the worst of the worst, right? Because that's what gets clicks, that's what gets the attention, views. But there are still institutions, right, where Americans gather without knowing each other's politics and they come together to unite. Obviously, one of those, for example, is sports, right? The arena, right? Americans unite in certain venues um, and can feel like they know one another. And one of those venues is the movie theater. You're wearing a Superman shirt. This summer, James Gunn released a new take and a new vision on the character of Superman, who has been around since what, 1938?
Yes, yeah, 1938.
1938. Superman's a character portrayed as a symbol of hope. Why did it connect? It became a cultural phenomenon, right? The song Punk Rocker, all right? It became a cultural phenomenon. Why is that connecting right now?
That's an excellent question. And you've opened a can of worms because I could talk for hours about comic books and Superman specifically. But I think the reason this movie connected and became the kind of phenomenon that it did is because it Superman is as needed today as he was in 1938. So for listeners who are unfamiliar with the history of Superman, he was created by two Jewish teenagers in Cleveland, Ohio, in 1938 who were living through the rise of fascism and the Great Depression, and they were the sons of immigrants. Much of their daily life was characterized by struggle, not unlike unlike the youth of today. And so Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster felt that they needed a crusader, even if only a fictional one, to stand up for people like them, for the downtrodden of society. And so they created this character who was a muckraking journalist who, secretly had these extraordinary abilities and would use them to affect change. The early stories in the 1930s and the 1940s, Superman was an active change agent in society. He was an active anti-fascist. He was fighting the Nazis. He would fight slumlords. He would fight. He would drag generals to the front lines of war and show them the horror they were inflicting on infantrymen. Um, he would fight domestic abusers. essentially he would fight society's ills. And that was an inspiring, meaningful thing to the youth who were reading those stories, because it showed that this idea of hope that we talk about is not an abstract, sort of far off kind of thing. It's tied to action. You can have hope in a better future, and you can also actualize that by engaging in society, by attempting to change things, even under, nigh insurmountable circumstances. And this recent iteration of Superman that James Gunn produced, is addressing a lot of the same kind of social issues that I think, it's reminiscent of the early Superman stories. It's a Superman who, I mean, I don't necessarily want to spoil the whole movie for those that haven't seen it. It did come out like 2 months ago at this point. But it's about a Superman who is socially conscious, who actually takes a stand and does things. He affects change, even when he like is bombarded with hate, from various people, or is made an enemy of the state for doing so. Sometimes doing the right thing will make you an enemy of the state, and that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. Um, my granddad, my labor organizer granddad, had this. He always had these like folksy aphorisms that I've like lived my life by, but one of them was like, you don't do the right thing because it's rewarding. You don't even do the right thing because it necessarily works, because sometimes it doesn't. You do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. It's the decent thing to do. It's kind. And that is what this version of Superman is so emblematic of. It's like it's doing the right thing is about being kind. And I think that that's a message that people really needed. It's a very, I don't think it's a stretch to say that we're living through a very socially isolating and polarized time. And in that environment, our society desperately needed an injection of, what our generation calls hopium. We needed an injection of a reminder that we can be kind and that goodness can prevail, if only a fictional one. And so yeah, I really do. It might sound silly, that I take these comic book characters so seriously, but they really are emblematic of deeper needs in society and deeper desires in society. And I think that Superman he's been such an enduring symbol in America because there's never been an absence of real injustices that we need, imagined crusaders to inspire us to fight back against.
That was awesome. That was really cool.
Thank you.
Um, so I want to move towards wrapping up. I have one more substantive question that I want to ask before we wrap up. I want to ask every guest that comes on here this question because I think it's important. But in your day-to-day life, what do you do to foster respectful dialogue? In other words, what would you offer as a challenge to people who find it difficult to have conversations with people who disagree with them, and maybe they're quick to hurl insults, call someone a name? What would you challenge people to do better? We talk about things stemming from bottom up or top down, and it would really be great if we lived in a country where our leaders treated each other with respect and kindness, but that's not the current environment in American politics. And so it might have to be something that starts from the bottom up. How we treat each other um, as individuals matters. What would you challenge people to try to do a little bit better at?
That's a good question. I would say two things. And the first of which is, don't be afraid. We need to start breaking down the barriers to talk about politics generally. Because I mean, traditionally, politics is considered an impolite, source of conversation. You're not supposed to bring up politics at the dinner table, or at Thanksgiving. And I think that we should reframe our sense of civility, into into thinking that talking about politics is normal and good actually, because if we have a social standard that inhibits you from talking about politics, that's going to lead to a society that doesn't, that isn't very politically attentive or politically engaged. So that's the one thing. But the thing that has to be paired with that is that when you do encounter someone who has, opposing politics, you have to approach it from a place of, the way I put it is comprehension has to come before critique. So you have to make an effort, even if it's something that you have an instinctual kind of visceral reaction to. You have to make an effort to understand the logic and the rationale behind what they're saying. You have to try to understand where they're coming from, and that has to go both ways. And at the end of the day, you might leave with more criticisms of them than you had from the beginning, but those criticisms will be informed. They'll be, they will be, they'll be structured based on what you understand about that person as a human being, not just how you sort of identify them at, first glance. Um, so that would be my advice is like don't be afraid to talk about politics, but then paired with that, make when you're talking to someone, you have to make sure you understand, you comprehend their politics before you critique them.
Yeah, that's brilliantly put. I think, as two people, we've spent our fair share of time in the classroom on a college campus. It seems to me that so many, and I'm not blaming them, but it seems to me that so many people are so afraid not only to talk about politics, but to disagree. And I would
Mm.
challenge everyone listening to this and to remind them that it's okay to disagree as long as it's done with a certain amount of, genuine behavior, right? You're disagreeing genuinely by listening, by trying to comprehend their rationale and logic, but still walking away. You don't have to agree. You can walk away on opposing sides of a view. You don't have to be friends, but at least you leave that conversation with a certain level of respect for one another as not only fellow Americans, but just as human beings.
Right. In addition to Superman, I'm a big fan of Star Trek. And I think a good way to, to cap this off would be Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, has this quote that I'm going to paraphrase because I don't remember the precise details of it. But the gist of it is that, an ideal society is not one where disagreement shuts down a conversation. An ideal society is when someone says they disagree with you, you respond, "Thank you. Please tell me why."
Yeah. I I'm so grateful to have you on this. I mean, what an enlightening conversation this has been, and it's important to me that those listening to this, who are really interested in what a particular guest has to say, our guests are, the people I have lined up to come on here, they're all brilliant, yourself included. So for those who want to follow what you're doing, read your writings, where can they find you?
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to plug my stuff. So you can find me. I publish op-eds occasionally in professional outlets, and you can find that work on Muckrack. So if you just search AJ Schumann on muckrack.com. I also have my own newsletter called The Satellite, which I publish on Substack that I just started last month. And I plan to make, at the very least, a monthly contribution to, if not more frequent than that. And so I would very much welcome new readers. And again, even like as we've been talking about over the course of this conversation, I'm open to critique. I'm young, I'm still learning. And even if you read my stuff and you disagree with it, I would love to know why.
Well, if you are watching this, I encourage you to engage, engage in the comments, talk about, your thoughts, share your opinions, but also do so just while you're watching this. Try to remember there's a journalist named Mark Halperin who I enjoy, and on his platform, Two Way, he always um, sets the tone for disagreement by saying, give the guest the presumption of grace. So if you're listening to this and you find yourself disagreeing with some things or everything that a guest says, make sure you give them the presumption of grace and engage honestly. Thank you so much, AJ, for coming on. I really appreciate this.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was a great conversation.